So here I am, just off of Overland Trail. The Horsetooth Reservoir is just up that way to the west, and I am at the old road to the Hughes Stadium property. The Hughes Stadium property was at the heart of a big communal conversation and debate that we had here in Fort Collins about its future. CSU had built the new stadium in the middle of their campus, and their old stadium, which was falling into disrepair, well, they had to figure out what to do with it. Now, originally, CSU had decided they wanted to sell it to a developer so they could build housing, but that didn't go over well with many residents. They wanted this space to turn into a natural area. And so in 2021, there was a referendum in which citizens put on the ballot a non-binding request that the city actually negotiate with CSU to buy this property, which passed with over 60%. Now, the city has entered into negotiation and is going to pay CSU for the site to preserve it, to keep it as an open space. And for a while, I thought that was the end of the story. And that was until I heard about the Hughes Land Back movement. Groups of activists, both native and non-native, are actually making a different request. Not only be maintained as an open space, but be put under the stewardship of native peoples, to be used for the purposes of native peoples. This is part of a land back movement. What does that mean? Well, all of this land was under the stewardship of Indigenous peoples before Western colonizing powers. And through various means, the land was taken from them. This could have been through warfare, cultural genocide, treaties that were signed under duress, but through various mechanisms, this land moved from the stewardship of Indigenous peoples to the ownership of non-Indigenous people. And so a group of activists has been asking for this land to be given back. When I moved to Fort Collins, I started to look at the history. Where did this place come from? And here I am on the corner of Overland Trail, which was an actual trail that settlers would use to go to California and to go west to Oregon. So the fort in Fort Collins was protecting this trail of settlers moving across Indigenous land from, well, the Indigenous peoples pushing back upon that settlement. The other thing I learned about Fort Collins is we're pretty centered on this institution, Colorado State University. It is a big player. Coming from Canada, I'd never heard of this thing called a land grant university. And so when I heard that, I thought, okay, so the land that CSU is on, well, that land was given to them, a land grant. But it's actually a little bit more complicated. And I want to go somewhere to tell that next part of the story.
There's no doubting that Colorado State University is at the heart of the Fort Collins community. Since its founding, it has been a major economic engine, drawing students to Fort Collins and enriching the local economy. CSU employs roughly 7,000 workers. And when you account for the jobs that are created in Fort Collins to support CSU, well, it almost doubles, which means that about 20% of the jobs in Fort Collins are related to CSU's existence. But how did CSU get its start? To understand the answer to that question, we have to go back to 1862, when President Abraham Lincoln signed the Morril Act. The act offered thousands of indigenous lands to each state for free to endow in agricultural colleges like CSU. Some land had already been taken from Native nations through treaty, secession, or seizure, but much of the land would actually be taken after the act was signed. In western states like Colorado, most of the land that was given to colleges was located within their borders. In eastern, southern, and midwestern states, land could be pretty much from anywhere. Now, most states sold their land to speculators to raise money for their endowments, but many universities still maintain ownership over these tracts of land. The Morril Act was a pivotal moment in the history of higher education because it provided probably the single biggest investment in higher education institutions.
So here I am at CSU's Foothills campus. It has a lot of different complexes, from their equine area, the Temple Grandin Center, to atmospheric sciences and the Forest Center. All of this is contained right here, just a little bit north of the former Hughes Stadium. Now, we came here specifically because this area has a very particular part in the history of CSU, which is that this very land was given to CSU to be sold or used or leased as a part of their institution.
According to an expose done by High Country News entitled Land Grab Universities, Colorado State University received 89,000 acres from the Morril Act. This gave CSU $400,000 to be used in perpetuity because the money had to go into an endowment, which, if we adjust for inflation, gives us approximately $10 million that has generated income and interest for CSU from its beginning. Now, the 89,000 acres that CSU was granted all over Colorado, a few chunks to the west of the city, but then over here in Steamboat, near Pueblo, down near Colorado Springs, and even near the Oklahoma border. This land was given to Colorado State University, even though the treaties that gave the U.S. government formal ownership over the land were entered into duress, were the product of mistranslation, were done under threat of violence. And the compensation for Indigenous peoples, well, was pennies on the dollar. In fact, the endowment return on payments to tribes was 130 to 1. CSU got $130 for every $1 that the U.S. paid for Indigenous title.
CSU would not be CSU if, well, it weren't for this land and the 89,000 acres it was given. It would not have succeeded. Which means that the prosperity and the modern incarnation of Fort Collins and northern Colorado would not be who we are, well, without the land that was given to CSU. And so the question for us is, if that land that was given wasn't the federal government's to give, that means that all the prosperity that we have here in Fort Collins now, there's a debt to be paid for that prosperity.
And so to talk about what it would mean for us to give back, I had the pleasure of sitting down with two amazing Indigenous women to hear about the Land Back movement and their role here locally in Fort Collins. I'm so grateful to be joined here by two Indigenous women, Christinia Eala and Elissa Tivona, who are part of women's-led Indigenous organization Tioshpaye Wiya Maka.
This area that we're in now was the Arapaho, Northern Cheyenne before they were divided. It was their territory. The Utes were here, Apache, Shoshone, Lakota. There were a number of tribes that were here, and it turned into a gathering place because this whole area is sort of like in a bowl. And so a lot of the Plains tribes actually traveled here and made this a gathering place during the migration of the buffalo, because we all followed the buffalo because that's how we survived. You know, the migration of the buffalo led or started the migration of the Indigenous peoples too, so that they could survive through the winters and have the hides for clothing and for housing and food. Buffalo is very, very sacred to us because the Lakota beginning story is that we lived down in Wind Cave, and the buffalo, our brothers, were down there with us. And this was during the Great Flood. When the waters started to dry up, we always took our cues from the buffalo because, as I said, they were our big brothers. And so when it was time for us to emerge, the emergence, looking around at a brand new world, because obviously the terrain had changed and shifted, the buffalo showed us how to live in harmony with the earth. Well, that started to change when the people arrived from Europe and started moving this way. There were millions and millions and millions of Native Americans that were murdered, and the massacres were huge and violent, extremely violent. Europeans that came here didn't know anything about living in harmony with the earth. And so the depletion that we see in every aspect of nature is what they brought with them.
To bring it briefly into the present, I mean, that's what's so disturbing about this whole thing. CSU was on the verge of selling the former site of Hughes Stadium to a developer, and they were going to develop housing to the tune of making millions and millions of dollars. I think that really lit a fire under Sarah and under the students and the community people that she was able to recruit to this initiative. And so that was when they focused on getting it rezoned as public open space. That, was a victory in some ways for preserving the actual land. But this next step of being able to return it to stewardship of the original caretakers.
Can you say a bit more about what that means? Like why it's important to give it back into stewardship, and what stewardship, like Indigenous stewardship, would mean?
This is a really good question, don't you think, Christinia?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's a very deep question. First, I'll just say how Elissa and I got involved. They were having a walkabout on there, I think the first walkabout, and Amber Lane called and asked me if I could join them. And she said, because it's part of a land back initiative in Fort Collins. Well, I had been hearing about land back and researching it for about 2 years. And so I was pretty surprised when I found out that we had a land back initiative right here in our front yard. And so I said, oh yeah, I would love to join you. So I did, went on the walkabout, but I'll tell you, my breath was taken away as we headed north down a trail, and we came across 2 gigantic cottonwoods, twin cottonwoods, and it really took my breath away, because for the Lakota people, that's our tree of life, and it's very sacred to us. And I could feel the spirits around it, because I could visualize people coming together, Indigenous tribes coming together and meeting in that space. I could feel that energy. So I said, oh yeah, I want to become involved in this. Somebody asked me if I knew anything about intergenerational grieving and healing.
Yeah.
And I am the first woman on my mother's side who was never sent off to boarding school. And I'm so grateful to her for that, because boarding schools, as we now know, have raped, murdered, tortured, and beaten children for speaking their language, for the smallest infraction. They were terrible places. So I have been on a healing journey, trying to come to terms with the abuse that I suffered from my mother, that she suffered from hers. It starts out by acknowledging we have to learn about the abuse, what created that abuse to begin with. Because, in the beginning times before the invasion and the colonization, my understanding of Lakota life on the land is that at night the family were all together in their teepee, in their home, and during the day divided the camps into 2 camps, 2 day camps. One was for women and one was for the men. And boys who were prepubescent spent their time in the women's camp with the women. And while they were there, they learned about being helpful. They learned about love and tenderness, how to live with the universal laws. The universal laws is to treat each other with kindness and to help each other. When the boys reached pubescence, then they graduated into the men's camp. And in the men's camp is where they learned how to become warriors. They got to choose warriors, hunters, spiritual leaders, protectors, how to protect the camp. That's what it was for us before. And then came the colonizers. And then after the colonizers, the survivors were gathered up and herded onto what are really concentration camps. We went from learning all how to live with the earth, how to live with each other, how to honor the universal laws, to how we are today. I mean, this is all about the intergenerational grieving, and the healing is learning to understand, how did it begin? How did we go from who we were in the beginning times to who we are today? Well, it was imposed on us. And if you don't have a way to heal yourself before you start your own family, that's carried forward. And we weren't even allowed to practice our ceremonies, because we do have ceremonies that help us heal from those things. I've been through many of those ceremonies now on my healing journey. So you have to start with learning the history, asking your mother, your father, what was your childhood like? And when they tell you what their childhood was like, It opens up your eyes, and then comes the forgiveness. We have to learn to forgive one another. And with forgiveness comes healing and understanding. And then comes activism.
You can imagine how the challenge of walking all that back, to try and walk it all back so people can relearn how to live in a good way and live in harmony with one another and with the land.
Elissa is going to speak about in a moment a planned action on the Hughes land in June, an encampment in which people are going to be invited to transform the space into a community healing space.
The imagining of the reemergence encampment over the solstice in June is just a first step to try and do that. How would we walk it back? What would workshops look like to help people learn how to live in right relationship with the land, learn the stories, learn the spoken words, learn the performances, and see again how to reimagine relationship with the earth. And so this is a one step, hopefully eventually evolving to be an annual event or an annual series of events that could take place in the context of Northern Colorado. I don't understand fully the notion of reparation, but to me, this feels like a step towards reparation. You can't walk back everything that happened ancestrally. It's a long and very painful history, and it's very difficult to sit with it and to hear it.
Mm.
But also, I think Teoshpe Wimaka wants to also introduce hope as a way to move forward. And what does that look like, especially for the young people?
Mm-hmm. And so we'll be building 2 lodges and having prayers. I've invited as well the veteran community to join us on that, because there are so many veterans who also suffer from PTSD. Now, PTSD isn't just for soldiers who have been to war. Any woman who's ever been beaten or raped has PTSD. Any man who has ever had to fight for his family against, any unseen thing that could come their way, they suffer from PTSD. And so that's what these lodges are for, to help bring them back. The Lakota have a ceremony. It's known as the calling back the spirit, because whenever you undergo any kind of violence, during the time of the violence, the act of violence, your spirit leaves your body. When it comes back, though, a piece of it is split off, and it doesn't go back into your body. And so you're left feeling there's something going on, something is missing. What is missing? And what it is a piece of your spirit. And it happens every time you undergo violence. So when you call back the spirit, you're made whole again, and you can feel it. And then you have an understanding again of who you are. You can put yourself in balance again. You can find your center again.
What better way to call back those spirits, to bring those lives back into right relationship than under those or nearby those twin cottonwoods?
Yes, absolutely. And that's where we want to build them.
Can I ask a question, Christinia? You spoke about the ways that violence splits our spirit.
Uh-huh.
Does it work the other way too? That when we visit violence upon another, a part of our spirit is split away too?
Well, I think that people who have experienced violence, okay, so they have that now in their cellular memory, and it's what they've been through that causes them to create violence around them. And so, yes, they do have their spirit, part of their spirit that isn't there with them, but they also have a dark energy that can take the place of that. They have to go through a healing as well. Calling back the spirit for them is also a good thing. Learning how to forgive them so they can forgive themselves.
I'm just thinking a lot of settlers, a lot of white folks, when they look at these questions of the legacies of colonialism, legacies of racism, that are legacies because they happened in the past and yet they are deeply present now.
Mm-hmm.
There is this sense of, I don't know what to do. As I was listening to you, I was just thinking that there's healing that needs to happen because of how settlers, white folks, have visited violence upon others,
Mm-hmm.
and how there's just in how you were speaking about the encampment, just I sense this possibility for this healing to happen in a communal way, in a together way, which isn't to say there isn't spaces for each of
Yes.
us to have our own
Well, yeah.
important spaces, but just that it's a healing that isn't just about Indigenous people. It's about the set of relationships that we are bound together in.
Absolutely. And I'm so happy that you brought that up.
Just a little plug for our effort, where there will be some opportunities for community members to participate in helping to set up camp. So the encampment is Saturday and Sunday, the 18th and 19th. In the days leading up to that, we're going to have work sessions that people are invited to participate, to help put up the teepees, to help build the lodge, to help put up the shelter, and hopefully through this participation with Indigenous leadership, folks will get a taste of what it is like to participate in this way, to participate tactily and participate hands-on and participate through their hearts and listen to story as part of working. It's not, separate, it's all the same. The proximity of the church to the Hughes land is pretty convenient. I mean, so hopefully if there's people that want to participate on that level, we'll provide an opportunity for them to do that. I do feel for what you're asking, Sean, about, people do now have a longing and a yearning. I don't think it's helpful to tell these stories so that people, are drowned in shame or guilt or, oh my God, look what my people did to your people. I mean, that's just not useful now.
No, it's not.
Useful is to have opportunity to shift, to transform, to act in a different way. And usually, I mean, one of the things that keeps me so invested in this project is that you find out you can do these things and have fun. There's a lot of laughter, and there's a lot of singing, and there's a lot of opportunity to exercise yourself physically.
And to know you were part of something, you were part of creating it. Yeah, it's such a feel-good thing.
As I was speaking with Christinia and Elissa, the words of Joy Harjo, the poet from the Muskogee Creek Nation in Oklahoma, saxophonist and past U.S. Poet Laureate, started to ring in my ears. You can't just begin anywhere. It's a wreck. Someone has to make it out alive, sang a grandfather to his grandson. His granddaughter, as he blew his most powerful song into the hearts of the children. There it would be hidden from the soldiers who would take them miles, rivers, mountains, from the naval cord place of their origin story. He knew one day, far day, the grandchildren would return generations later over slick highways constructed over old trails, through walls of laws meant to hamper or destroy, over the libraries of the ancestors in the wind, born in stones. His song brings us to his home place in these smoky hills. Begin here. Begin here. With the stories that tell of the beginning. Begin with the stories that have been passed down from generation to generation of the origins, of the beginning times, of the hope to stay alive. And it is in these stories that we find our way back towards right relationship, towards what it means to be in this together. As I spoke to Christinia and Elissa, I was curious about how the questions I initially thought would be important about what Hughes Land Back would mean and what native land stewardship would look like were not what they wanted to talk about. Instead, we talked about the land itself, its history, its place as a meeting place for Indigenous peoples, about the generations of harm that colonization has caused, but also for the potential for that harm to find healing in relationship, the healing that comes from hearing the stories in circle with elder. I felt the pull of what Kelly Brown Douglas refers to as the broadening of an immoral imagination. I mean, what would it mean for us as people of this land to open ourselves to asking the hard questions about what does open space mean? Open for whom? Space for what? What assumptions about our responsibility for the prosperity we have been granted by the theft of land? What is it? And how can we do that work of righting that harm in relationship? Now, many institutions, including CSU, have started offering land acknowledgements, naming the original stewards of this land in their work. But that's not enough. Kuchabaldi, who is the chair of the Native American Studies Department at Humboldt State University in California, offers this really instructive analogy. Imagine this: your roommate's boyfriend comes in one day and steals your computer. He uses it in front of you, and when you point out that actually that's your computer, not his, he disagrees. He found it, you weren't using it, it's his. She asks, how long until you're going to let that go? How long until you're like, never mind, I guess it's your computer now? What if years later, the boyfriend of your roommate feels bad about taking your computer, but he has this great idea? What if he puts a plaque on it that says it belongs to you? That way, every time he uses it, everyone will know that it used to be your computer. It will be his formal acknowledgement that it used to be yours. How would you feel about that? Baldi concludes, the more work that we do with decolonization and reconciliation, the more you start to realize there is no reconciliation without the return of stolen land. It doesn't work otherwise. And as Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, the idea of reparations is frightening, not simply because we might lack the ability to pay, like how would we give all this land back? The idea of reparations is threatening because it threatens something much deeper: America's heritage, history, and standing in the world. And it raises all sorts of questions for us. I imagine questions that you're asking yourselves now. But I think the biggest one for us to ask is, why aren't we trying? We must look at the past and not simply feel sorry and acknowledge it, but move towards doing sorry, some sort of reparations. Doing sorry means facing our ghosts, paying our debts, surrendering to the transformation that repair demands, that we might have to leave behind what we were, who we were, with all of its trappings and privilege. Repair means owning up to what we have done, accepting the inconveniences of our own actions, even if we weren't the ones that caused them, but only benefited from them, and leaning into relationship to guide us forth. Now, one of my classmates in seminary, Michael Wolf's, his congregation, a Baptist congregation in Evanston, Illinois, is working on their own reparations work. And in an article in Sojourners, he posed this powerful question: what if we thought that churches were spaces where reparations were uniquely possible? Since churches are institutions rooted in a particular place, memories of harm and past wrongdoing tend to linger and reverberate, but with this deep woundedness comes the potential for accountability. Maybe our church is interested in addressing the legacy of white supremacy. Maybe our church is uniquely suited to tend to those wounds, to see how the land might be a source of wounding, and that we might be willing to put our resources on the line in order to heal those wounds.